Thank you so much for coming today. I've been talking about this subject so much because I was so compelled by it that I feel like I've already told everybody the genesis of this. But Eric and I had seen this wonderful show at the Louvre last fall, and it was so compelling, and I took so many pictures, both of the wall tags and of the images of the work presented, that I ended up thinking, I should really give a talk about this. I'm so fascinated by it. And I really invite your responses and thoughts afterwards. And if you can't stand it one more minute during. But this is the genesis of the show. So I'm sharing it with you largely exactly the way that it was presented, but I've rearranged some things that made more sense to me. And I will be reading a little more than usual because I did want to stay true to the show. I want you to really have more of its experience. But being me, I have a lot of ideas that I have added and things that I discovered when I was researching it. So I'll be sharing those with you too. So, most societies and cultures around the world have tricksters, figures who represent a wild side of things, a reversal of the moral order, what is considered to be our wilder or more natural selves. I'm sure you're all familiar with that. And that are permitted on certain ceremonial occasions to go a little crazy, joined by participants or celebrants. Think Saturnalia around Christmas time. Think Mardi Gras. But this exhibition was about a moment in time where fools were everywhere, every day, and thoroughly infiltrated the societies of the late Middle Ages and the early Renaissance. In France and in the Netherlands particularly, this show focuses on those artists more than any others. And all respect to its brilliant curators, who I must name because they were so amazing, Elisabeth, Antoine Koenig, and Jean-Yves Le Pogam. And they are just, it's their work, their scholarship must have taken just years and years. I know it was a very long researched thing. So what I'm showing you is an abbreviated version of the exhibition, which was truly enormous. I mean, it was this magnitude was staggering. So I'm sharing it with you in a slightly more manageable form, because otherwise we'd be here for 6 or 7 hours. This is a figure of a fool that I want to begin with. It appeared on all the posters for the show, and the show is called Figure du Fou, Figures of the Fool. And it's attributed to the master of 1537, who is a Flemish painter, active between 1520 and 1570. Now, he specialized in cheeky-looking characters, and you'll be recognizing this fool's traits in other work in the exhibition. The donkey's ears on his cap, you can see the one on the left, which is topped by a coxcomb. You see the red, like, kind of ridged thing on the top of his head is a reference to a coxcomb. The bicolored outfit, and you'll see many other examples of that. Fake glasses that he's holding, which are reference to his disdain of scholarship because he's a fool. And his staff, which is topped with a tiny fool's head of its own, a bizarre circularity, because it kind of looks like him with another expression. This is a very common thing. Fool's caps could also feature asses' ears, asses' tails, horns, and masks. Their staffs are sometimes crowned by a rooster's head, indicating cuckoldry. In other words, your wife's cheating on you, or vice versa. His gesture of looking through his fingers was to be interpreted as a husband turning a blind eye to his wife's indiscretions. But it could also refer to the threat of a moral or illegal situation that he's ignoring and tolerating. So you'll see too, this is a constant amount of double entendres and occasionally seeming contradictions. But to continue, the Figures of the Fool exhibition at the Louvre began with a wall text with an admonishment from Psalm 53 of the Bible, which says, "The madman says in his heart, there is no God." But in a seeming contradiction, the first featured images were examples of the madness of St. Francis of Assisi, one of the great examples of a fool who was inspired by God-ordered empathy, who speaks the language of animals, unburdens himself of his worldly possessions, and becomes a fool of God. So that's one example of some of the dichotomies that we'll encounter. The richest historical impact and popularity of the fool was manifested most strongly from the 13th through the 16th centuries, and toward the end of the exhibition, there were examples of the impact of the emergence of the Age of Reason, at which time fools then generally held less appeal and caused more fear and anxiety, because by then they were seen as people of incurable insanity, rather than special members of society and symbols. At the end of the show, there was representation of Romanticism and its fascination with madness, not the same thing at all as what the late medieval Renaissance fool represented. Renaissance fools, however, are still critical characters in present culture, in the enduring power of the plays of Shakespeare, for example, with fools who flaunt social conventions to convey truths others might not dare, especially when speaking truth to power. Fools then were hermits, simpletons. This is fools in the 1500s. Fools then were hermits, simpletons, sinners mocking courtly love, party animals, buffoons both royal and common, mad kings, seekers and seers, licentious seductors, jugglers, conjurers, and not least of all, artists. Today, some streets in Paris are still referred to as Rue de la Folie, or streets of madness, meaning that they are or had been red light districts where fools sought pleasure. Playing cards still have jokers, and Van Gogh and his immense popularity can be seen as one of our great fools or madmen for art. As truth-tellers to kings, fools still bear witness to the folly of human behavior on all levels of society. So let's start with fools in Christianity. This is St. Francis of Assisi, and his nickname was known as God's juggler. So he was referred to very specifically as a fool during his lifetime. This painting is one of the earliest depictions of him, painted very shortly after his death in 1226, and his quick canonization in 1228, 2 years later. That does not happen today. It may have been produced at the request of Gregory IX, who was the Pope then, and who had known Francis well and supported him. This is one of the oldest images showing Francis's stigmata, which are the marks of the passion from the crucifixion of Christ, which are reproduced on the saint's body at his hands, feet, and heart. You know the stigmata from the cross, so it's a famous sign of sainthood. In the next slide, if you look at the upper left, you'll see the legend of St. Francis. The whole panel on the left is the legend of St. Francis. And the pane on the upper left of the left-hand image is Francis daring to kiss a leper, which was obviously a dangerous, insane thing to do at the time. And only a societal outcast would have done such a mad thing. But he was showing his faith in God. And on the lower right of the same set of four, he renounces his former life and refuses to obey his father by abandoning his clothing to, as he put it, follow in the nakedness of the naked Christ. And he had all the earmarks of the fool because of his behavior. The first century writings of St. Paul say that what is folly in the eyes of man is wisdom in the eyes of God. And in the scene on the right, we see Francis of Assisi actually putting into practice this inversion of values. And the inversion is an important aspect of this. St. Francis broke with both the world into which he was born, the wealthy Italian bourgeoisie, and the life that he was meant to have, which was to have been part of the brilliant aristocracy, to have enjoyed the adventures and eventual knighthood of his class. He renounced it all. He renounced his entire family. He spoke with birds. He dressed like a beggar. And then he finally received the stigmata. He has been known as God's juggler or God's fool ever since. Now, the vast majority of illuminated manuscripts were produced for religious reasons, and there were many examples in this exhibition. And they only later started featuring secular subjects, like when you think of the Book of Hours that involve planting and planting times and the cycle of the seasons. You're getting into later examples of illuminated manuscripts. And the printing press, which was invented in the 1400s, gradually overtook the remarkable workshops that had produced them. And most of the artisans that made them are unnamed. We really don't know who's responsible for them. I have to say that illuminated manuscripts have always made me feel a little exhausted even before I started looking at them. So much information, such little pictures, et cetera, et cetera. But this show changed all of that, like Psalters, which are prayer books, books of hours, and the Moralizing Bible, an example of which is on the right, which was a tremendously ambitious project to do an entire picture book of the Bible for the faithful who didn't read, because most people didn't read Latin, and these were all mostly in Latin still. And it was executed by the Limburg brothers, and all of their work represented the fool, and many illustrated manuscripts of the Middle Ages contain drawings of fools, mostly found in the margins of the pages, hence the word marginalia, which we use for different things today. They exist apart from the text's main focus, and they're not always drawn by the artists themselves who were making the books. They were sometimes added, like graffiti, by readers. These fools are an important source for understanding the common culture and particularly the humor of the time. So there was information in the marginalia that was being transmitted and shared with others, sometimes not at the behest of the actual authors of the books. So the large D, that's a D on the left-hand side, contains a whole scene in which it could be said that the fool is telling on the faithful who are making out and ignoring God, and God has an expression of obvious displeasure. It's like, oh my God. It's from the Great Bible of London, and the image on the right is from as I said, is from the Moralizing Bible, and it represents a scruffy fool refusing wisdom, a common challenge for the faithful who were urged to preach self-discipline in the face of carnal pleasures, which at the time was just one of the only constant and attainable pleasures in a society plagued by poverty and regular literal plagues, actually plagues from the plague of Justinian in the 6th century, which is sort of the first recorded plague, to the Black Death in the 14th century, were ongoing, and outbreaks continued throughout the Middle Ages into the Renaissance. So plagues were not just a one-off thing. If you've read the book Hamnet, that shows you that there was even plagues into the time of Shakespeare. So next, so here's some great examples of marginalia. In examples of the marginalized character, all right, turn off your phones. Who didn't turn off their phone? Okay, thank you. In examples of the marginalized characters of marginalia, you find overt, embarrassing, and sexual behavior that provide a kind of laugh track that goes along with, but is not necessarily in accordance with, the seriousness of the rest of the text. So you can have a hymnal like the upper left, and you can have this doodle, which is part of the intended marginalia and was clearly made by the artist who made the book, but that has really nothing to do with the text itself. It's really curious to me that knights, chevaliers, the representatives of chivalry, are often found in absurd positions, like the one battling the double-headed fool as Griffin in the upper left, and you can see that he has a face on his butt as well on the upper left. And one repeated wacky theme that I encountered, especially like reading about this afterwards, was the knight in combat with a snail, like in what is clearly a doodle on the upper right, And it's clearly a doodle that a reader added to the book. I can't imagine how the monks that owned this book or whatever thought about that, but that was not explained, and I couldn't find more about it. And the upper left, the meaning of the snail knight in combat, snail versus knight combat, is not at all clear to scholars. It's speculated to possibly be about the struggles of the poor against an oppressive aristocracy, or to represent the snail as an annoying garden pest. I can understand that. Or a commentary on social climbers, or a saucy symbol of female sexuality. So I leave it to you. No one has ever quite figured out what they represent. On the lower right, you have two almost identical fools that are tethered together, wielding their staffs like weapons. They look like they're about to start a combat, which is an interesting way, I thought, of maybe showing a representation of the arguments that you have with your own self. I mean, we all know that one. The way that these little dramas pop up around the outsides of serious biblical subjects is really fascinating and gives a glimpse into the stories people were telling themselves and others at the time. So they're of interest to scholars, but they still remain mysteries. This is two very serious subjects. There's the deposition on the left and the presentation in the temple on the right, both from the New Testament. And nevertheless, there are these very curious, playful, scandalous figures in the margins, clearly planned and not doodled in later. These little drawings really feel to me to come from the subconscious, actually, like the little monsters of your psyche that express societally incorrect visions and behavior. On other pages of the Hours of Jean d'Evreux, which dates from 1324 to 1328, there are also depictions of victims of plague being cared for. Now, this was in the exhibition, and I found a site that had every single page of this book, and it's a fat little thing. And I literally couldn't find the image of the victims of the plague, because I thought, how fascinating, but I believe them. This fool is from the Psalter of the Duc de Berry, who is famous for other illustrated manuscripts, as well as a Psalter. And this beautiful, rather ethereal rendering of a fool was done in 1386 by Jacques-Mar de Hesdin for the famous Duc de Berry's Psalter. He's partly undressed, and he's biting into a piece of bread or cheese. No one's sure what that is exactly. And it's one of the earliest formal depictions of a fool, drawing on the previous work of the Queen of France's Hours of Jean d'Evreux. But in this case, the fool is in a forest, which is kind of unusual generally because he's usually seen in some sort of societal struggle or temptation or whatever. He has an elegant stance that belies his poverty. Clearly he's impoverished. And even his scepter looks graceful. The exhibition pointed out, which I thought was a very good note. And a fool's scepter could hold both meanings, that they could be they could be a scepter or they could be a club. And fools were known to have to carry clubs to back people off because of their bizarre behavior. So this, in a sense, as you saw in the first slide, how the scepter of a fool could be an alter ego of the fool himself. I think that this reflects the character of this fool somehow. I'm sorry to report that there was a short but significant section in the show about anti-Semitism. And these are two examples. Anti-Semitism was unfortunately represented as early as the 1400s. In the scene on the left of Christ being judged by Pontius Pilate, the soldier on the left's party-colored costume and fool's hat, you can see him, he's the second over, could be mistaken as that of a stereotypical fool of the Middle Ages, but he also has a hooked nose, one of the stereotypical features of the era's caricatures of Jewish people. And then in the example on the right, carved stone bas-relief, you have the carrying of the cross, a very important moment in the death of Christ. and it's the spectators who are shown with caricatured features as images of spectators to the Passion. On the upper right, a child wears a hat characteristic of Jewish dress. It's not as vulgar as the one on the left, but still. And in the Middle Ages, Jews were accused of being accomplices to the sufferings of Christ. Some were depicted as mentally or physically deformed. And the man with bristly hair and the other with a shaved head, you can see the shaved head one easier, were then contemporary signs of derangement or infamy. So they were pretty subtle indications, but that there was this undercurrent of anti-Semitism is sad and disappointing. But that was a brief section of the show, and then we went on to fools as representations of lust and carnality and their moral warnings. This was so crazy to me. A great deal of the show was occupied, as I said, by engaging in trying to keep people from engaging in amoral behavior and warning them of its dangers, but especially the danger of seduction. So through engravings, the theme of the story of Aristotle and Phyllis spread throughout the Germanic world, especially in the 16th century. Here on the left, Master M.Z., who doesn't have otherwise, Matthaus Sassinger, has no qualms about accentuating the caricatured aspect of the scene. The philosopher Aristotle, and yes, it's that Aristotle, has been transformed into a beast of burden and seems to implore mercy of the beautiful Phyllis, who, according to the wall text, was whipping him energetically. I love that detail. So we're getting into some of the meat here. The story is that Aristotle, Greek philosopher and tutor of Alexander the Great, allowed himself to be humiliated by the seductive Phyllis as a lesson to the young ruler who had succumbed to her wiles and was neglecting affairs of state. So to encourage Alexander to witness his folly, Aristotle himself explained that if he, an old and supposedly wise man, could be so easily deceived, the potential consequences for a young man like Alexander were even more harmful. And there were many images like this, not in the show, but there were many images produced of this very popular example of folly. This slide to the right, this slide to the right shows an aqua manile, a water vessel used for washing hands. And that was made for a domestic setting. It's actually in the Met, so you could see it when you're in New York next time if they have it out. And it was, as I said, made for a domestic setting rather than a ritualistic religious setting. And the ribald subject would have doubled as an object of entertainment for guests at the table, as well as being a cautionary tale. So you'll notice as we go that there is a tremendous amount of prurient entertainment in the effort to warn people of the perils of lust. Speaking of, so here we have two works by Master E.S. and one by Allard du Hamel, which is in the middle. Let's see. On the left, three couples are in a half-enclosed garden. The composition reads like a frieze where from left to right, the satire of courtly love becomes more and more dangerous and close to consummation. So you can see on the left, the couples are just kind of talking and horsing around. And then by the two figures on the right, in the left-hand engraving, you have two people that are close to consummation or ready to go. And we know it's a dangerous situation because of the little owl perched over this scene. And see that little owl right between the first three figures on the left? There's a little owl in between. We'll talk more about owls later, but owls were not a good sign, let me put it that way. In the middle engraving, the noble attitude of the couple by the fountain is contradicted by two figures. The mannequin piece, can you make out that there's a little boy with his dick out, taking a pee, pissing on the top of the fountain, and then crouching under the basin, you can see that there's a fool looking directly at the viewer while lifting up the woman's skirt. So, I'm just saying. And then at the far right, which is, I think, the most lewd of the three, another engraving attributed to Master E.S., the great moralizer, who was also a German engraver and goldsmith, and known for his religious as well as his satirical works. This engraving on the right is called The Fool and the Naked Woman with Mirror, also known as Lust and the Fool, which features a stripped lady whose appearance and mirror symbolize lust, according to the wall tag. But really, let's face it, it's soft porn. So the male character is wearing a hood with bells, one of the giveaways of a fool, so don't miss that. That's fallen back on his shoulders. So it's a little harder to see because it's not perched on his head, but you can see the bell things. His pants are also slipping off, and they're both clearly succumbing to the moment. The parakeet on the rock, as according to the wall text, was a motif of Master E.S. meant to convey sensuality, in case you missed any of the other clues. Now this is called the collation, la collation, which means like a light meal. This tapestry was one of 4 and intertwines the idea of the hunt with the hunt for love in the Garden of Love. The revelers are separated, this is quite interesting, by a hedge. Can you see the hedge is kind of running straight through the middle at a upper to lower diagonal? And they're separated by a hedge, and in the foreground are courtly, restrained couples, but surrounding the fountain in the middle are base seekers of pleasure, and they're presided over by a fool. I actually had trouble seeing the fool. Can you make him out? Let me see if I can make this work. He's right there. And this juxtaposition acts as a kind of a morally distorted mirror imaging. And the coxcomb-like top of the fool's cap is very phallic symbol. And then the rabbit poking out of the lap of this woman represents her sex. So you have like pretty ostentatious clues for those in the know. And this tapestry is of a very popular subject, the prodigal son. And it's a good example of what was described as a more active role for the fool, although the other ones seem to be pretty busy to me. Although he's detached from what is a scene, highlighting the final dissolution of the prodigal son and his adventure, with wantonness. The woman on the left is most likely the hotel keeper or the barmaid tabulating the escalating bill that the prodigal son will have to pay for his folly, which is a warning to all wise people. And the fool, like a chorus in the play, So the fool is over here, and he's kind of mirroring the prodigal son. So the fool acts almost like a witness, and he has a particularly vacuous gaze that could be the result of the cat that seems to be prodding his crotch, I thought. And maybe he's also, as I said, a mirror reflection of the folly of the son. But he does look transported somehow. Without going into more detail, the tapestry also offers an example of foregrounding and backgrounding different events in the prodigal son life, which was a common theatrical device that was used in tapestries and in paintings and whatnot of the time. And in the middle pane, you can see him let's see if I can find him, over here, surrounded by pigs, when he's pretty much at his lowest. And then to the right, you have his homecoming. So they were doing a whole history within a single image. Now, so this is another example of the prodigal son. And it was found not only in art, but in theater itself, as the theatricality of the previous slide suggested. And this scene is, again, pointedly theatrical in the sense that it's showing slightly different times. The prodigal son is anguishing at a table. This is he, and this is the fool. And the fool in the left foreground, I think, is really a doppelganger, because he seems just as gloomy as the prodigal son, just as like kind of at they both hit bottom at the same time. On the left hand, the brothel keeper is also tabulating the son's bill, which looks to be quite impressive. And on the right, an entertainer enters the scene, as it were, with his pet bear and servant. The artist is unknown, which is really a shame because as I was looking at this, the psychological charge of the characters and the really great way that it was carved with such delicacy was very impressive. Ill-matched lovers and fools. So ill-matched lovers, also known as unequal couples, was a big popular theme in the 15th to mid-16th centuries. And they were always involved with the subject of a younger woman seducing an older man while handing his purse off for a fool to pocket. So you see this, what's going on here. And one interesting thing about this particular painting by Massis is that he was influenced by a character sketch that Leonardo had made that he'd seen, and that's the source for the old Lecher's portrait. I could not figure out what this was when I first saw it, but it turns out to be a rather unique towel holder where, I'm not kidding, it's a fantastic piece of carving, where a clearly poor fool, typically garbed with a worn outfit with donkey ears and little bell on his fool's cap, is embracing an elegant, to all intents and purposes, apparently well-to-do woman with great concentration and intent. And two tiny fools are on their shoulders, here and here. And there's another one poking out of her elbow right there. This practical sculpture serves as a warning to women to avoid losing their minds by succumbing to carnality. It's interesting to know that the artist gave this female character the same face as he had given to Mary Magdalene, the patron saint of penitent carnal sinners, which was made for an altarpiece in Kalmar, Germany. So, this is a wood engraving that I thought was stunning. It's, on the left is a woodcut in its unprinted state. So you take a piece of wood and you carve out all the parts that you want to be white. It takes a great deal of acuity and effort. And it's really brilliant. And then when it's printed, it looks like the one on the right. It shows a jester driven mad for love of a woman who is wearing nothing but the great feathered hat of a wealthy, elegant courtesan, doubtless an allegory of pleasure, if not meant to be a modernized Venus herself. In one hand, she holds a cuckoo, which is a 16th century symbol for a man under the thumb of a courtesan. And in the other, on the right-hand side, right there, she's holding a baby pacifier, indicating that the fool has returned to infancy under the spell of pleasure. And this was an astonishing sculpture. It's attributed to Shikhar Bai. I've never heard of him before. It's a carved ivory sculpture. It's tiny, but it's so powerful, it's ridiculous. It's vivid and it depicts a woman and death standing back to back. Everybody here knows what vanitas paintings are, yes? Do you all know? A vanitas is like a painting that it's usually used in reference to still life paintings that have beautiful, blooming, living flowers, and then slight, subtle indications of death and decay, like rotting fruit, something on a table that's kind of mushing or is blackened or whatever. So this is a vanitas sculpture warning people of taking too much pleasure in life when a greater beyond awaits them. So the woman holds a flower with one hand to her chest, you can see it on the left, and raises her clothing to reveal her sex very seductively and sensuously on the right. That is really quite literal. Death, in a mirroring gesture, wears a partly open cloth, revealing leg bones covered with worms coming and going, and they really do look like they're coming and going, as well as worms protruding from other areas of his skeleton. At first I wondered about this sculpture's direct relationship with the Fool, like where's the Fool? But in fact, I started looking at the figures below them. There's the base that they're standing on. And actually I realized that the woman and death are positioned on a ship of fools. A fool holds the rudder. You can see that in the right-hand side image. And the ship contains a chained monkey, a symbol of fools, with a basket of fruit, 2 potted trees, which is not unusual on a ship of fools, surprisingly. We'll talk about that later. And also 2 dogs, flanking a man who's unsheathing a sword. I'm not sure what that meant. I could not find a reference for it. But it's very, very powerful. So this is a copy of Basil's Dance of Death, the city of Basil's Dance of Death. This image was pretty large and was actually a reproduction of a painting that was done for the wall of a Dominican cemetery shortly after the return of a plague in 1439, and it was 196 feet long. So if you're wondering about how much the subject mattered at the time, and Johann Rudolf Feyerabend made a watercolor copy of it based on prior reproductions shortly after the municipal council destroyed it in 1805 for reasons that were not given. The scenes are all individually titled, things like death to the king, death to the shepherd, death to lawyers, etc., etc. And I was looking again for the Fool in this, and I actually had to look it up. I found it so kind of overwhelming. But the Fool is in the bottom. Well, I'll show you again in a second. But so he's actually being invited by death to dance with him. He pulls the Fool forward and to the dance, and the Fool follows. And you can see his look of resignation. There's a kind of maybe it's the Fool come to naught, finally. But there's all representation of folly in the work, in the larger work. And it really does have a macabre quality. I was quite impressed by it. And it starts, interestingly, with, It starts with this. That's the preacher. I had to look these up. And his congregation on the upper left. And then it continues, and finally you sort of reversely go to Adam and Eve at the bottom, and the Fool is just above them. So this is The Wise Man and the Fool, Jean Perial, from Petit Livre d'Amour, a little book of love from Lyon, and it was a gift from learned humanist Pierre Sala for his betrothed, a moralizing painting for his betrothed. Its poems deal mostly with love, but also morality. Here, a wise man of letters depicted as an evangelist at his lectern, in other words, Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, and a fool are drawing each other, illustrating the maxim on the left-hand page that denounces the world's hypocrisy, which makes the wise man play the fool and vice versa. And it says on the book, "We take the times as worldly school to play our parts. The times advise, the wise man counterfeits the fool pretends that he is wise." So, on the left, now we're getting to the point where we have fools everywhere, which was a kind of a denouement of the core of the exhibition. By around 1500, the figure of the fool had become omnipresent in European culture and society. 2 very different but complementary works of literature contributed to this. The first is this, which is, to the left, a plate from Narrenschiff, The Ship of Fools, by Sebastian Brandt from Basel. And it was published in 1497 with a woodcut that's attributed to Albrecht Dürer. That does look like Dürer to me. So it shows Lady Venus, accompanied by her son Cupid, holding on leashes men possessed by the folly of love, fools and clergymen. and asses and apes also, symbols of fools. The center colored plate is from a ship of fools from the same year. These books were always lavishly illustrated. People paid fortunes to have them done, and luckily some of them have survived. On the right is a ship of fools title page, in a much later version that was an English translation from Latin that was produced in 1570. So that's more than 70 years later. The book recounts an imaginary journey to the land of fools, Narragonia. Naran is the word for fools, plural, and Narragonia is the fool's paradise, meant to denounce contemporary foibles and the chaos of that epoch. It was an instant, unmitigated success. It became an instant international bestseller, going through 15 editions in various languages before the end of the 15th century. It was profusely illustrated in all early editions, and it satirically presents over 100 fools representing contemporary shortcomings from serious to trivial. Brandt was a religious conservative who wrote Narrenschiff to re-examine church and empire and to elevate his generation's behavior, all of which helped foment the Reformation. So this was a throwdown that really helped ignite the Reformation. And then it was followed shortly thereafter by In Praise of Folly by Erasmus. To the left is a portrait of Erasmus writing by Hans Holbein the Younger from 1528, an oil-on panel that's in the Louvre. And on the right, there's an edition of In Praise of Folly, written by, it's the same book, written by Erasmus on his way back to England in 1509, and published in 1511 as Moriae Encomium. So that's a translation of In Praise of Folly. It was obviously intended for a scholarly elite who could read Latin, but today his book is much more famous than Brandt's because his critique was a targeted forerunner of the theses of the Reformation that denounced the decadence of the Catholic Church, and its impact was huge. So as the figure of the fool was used to denounce the other, Catholics and Protestants declared a war of images along this theme against each other, which mirrored and reinforced the French wars of religion that occurred in the late 1500s. So this is a groundbreaking book. And the German painter Holbein must have discovered In Praise of Folly at a young age, since he drew illustrations from a copy of a 1515 edition, so shortly after it was published. He later met Erasmus and made several portraits of him at work in his study. In this portrait from the Louvre, the great figure of humanism appears to be concentrating on the writing of his paraphrase of Mark. There were a lot of forensic that went along with this show that the researchers did, which I found fascinating. So at this point, the plasticity of the concept of fools had reached its zenith, and they were reflected everywhere in the cultures of the times. Now we're getting to fools at court with the presence of artificial and real fools. There is a difference. To the left is a painting of a country feast at the court of Philip the Good, who ruled from 1419 to 1467. Philip the Good had 24 documented mistresses, fathered at least 18 illegitimate children, and when his father, John the Fearless, was murdered, Philip accused Charles, the Dauphin of France, and his brother-in-law of planning the murder. He continued the Armagnac-Burgundian War, which later became entangled in the 100 Years' War, and it was his troops who captured Joan of Arc at Compiègne and sold her to the British. What's in a name? Philip the Good. Philip's court was also the most extravagant and fashion-forward in Europe, and in a complication of his reputation, he was a dedicated patron of the arts, notably of Van Eyck, who I love, and Coquinet was his favorite jester. Drawn here on the right by Jacques Le Boucat in 1560 and part of the Arras collection, which is it's comprised of faithful copies of 290 old works that would otherwise be completely lost. And Coquinet is what would have been referred to as a natural fool, partly because of his physical traits, including his microcephaly, his small skull, and his hunchback, and he holds an unadorned staff that, as I'd mentioned before, fools use to ward off stones and dogs and people wanting them out of their lives. The catalog mentions he wears 15th century clothing, and the man is rendered uncompromisingly with its wrinkles, sagging flesh, and tired gaze. In other words, he's a real human. Since the painting on the left is a copy of an older work, its connections and likeness to the original are hard to verify, but inventories of the time mention a series of tapestries that depict various aspects of the hunt. Again, we go back to the hunt, and you might remember that collation tapestry. And inserting a recognizable member of Philip the Good's court in the form of coquinet tallies with the intent of the tapestries, which were to decorate actually a Habsburg residence. So one notable difference for you fashion people in the audience is that the dress of coquinet in the painting is made of a precious fabric, clearly, and is hardly the representation in the drawing, obviously. But it is consistent. The red, oh, I'm sorry, I should point this out. Do you all see him right here? So it is consistent with the records of cloths being bought for members of the aristocracy and the court at that time. But it's still, the red of his clothing, it's seriously startling in the midst of all that whiteness. And it expresses a special attention that's being given to him. So coquinet, and by the way, coquinet derives from coquine, meaning naughty, and court fools were often seen as having powers of second sight. So he may have been seen as a fool that spoke truth to power. This was astonishing. So this is an armet, a helmet, with a fool's face that belonged to Henry VIII. And it's big, it's like big, and the horns are wild. A significant part of court activities involved the vaunting of war efforts, because everybody was so proud of all their achievements. This helmet is the only extant element of a suit of armor which was offered as a diplomatic gift by the Emperor Maximilian I to Henry VIII of England in 1514. The face on this iron mask is a true masterpiece of armory and is that of a fool with his spectacles, again, a parody of a scholar's visage. The helmet has the shape of a fool's cap and was once crowned by a row of bells and ass's ears, which were later replaced by this pair of horns. For the powerful, wearing the face of a fool was meant to be a moral encouragement to virtue. But frankly, to me, this object is so surreally ferocious, I think it would principally have inspired fear, like the painted otherworldly faces of, warriors for centuries the world over. And medieval Renaissance fools were attributed with a divine lack of interest in the world, belonging to an otherworldly class of beings with clairvoyance. So to have this person riding towards you with this helmet in a battle, I definitely would have turned around. So here we have three court fools, one of whom is, well, all of them are well known, but Triboulet is particularly interesting. He's the fool of good King René. In the middle is Elisabeth, fool of Queen Anne of Hungary, lest you think that there were no female fools, but there were not many. And then there's the portrait of Kluns van der Rosen on the right. On the left, to make the portrait of his fool Triboulet in the mid-1400s, good King René of Anjou called upon one of the great Italian sculptors working at his court, either Francesco Laurana or his master Pietro da Milano, if you've ever heard of them. From the catalog, quote, "The sculptor released an effigy bursting with life. The fool seems almost as glorious as a Roman emperor. His appearance, with a tiny head and an enormous jaw, are signs of a natural fool, which did not hinder him from having a significant and successful career as a playwright and actor at René of Anjou's court." And we'll get to more about him later by accident. As for Elisabeth, in the center, there were fewer female fools, as I mentioned, and commissioned formal fools at court, commissioned formal portraits were very expensive, so they were rare in general, and certainly of people of secondary importance. It's thought that Elizabeth may have been a conjurer because, can you see she's wearing many rings, and also she has kind of a necklace that captures that motif, which were tools of the trade of a fool, and of a magician, actually. And her garb is in keeping with the fool's role and not of the fashion of the time. So it was clearly a very expensive, specialized outfit made for her. She may also have doubled as a governess and teacher for the children of Anne of Hungary and her husband, Archduke Ferdinand I, who became Holy Roman Emperor. The portrait is affectionately detailed, and the letter she's holding suggests her literacy, and I think her intelligence is so obvious. I mean, she's looking right at the artist and at you. She has a bemused and knowing and self-contained gaze. I was very impressed by this. And then Kurt von der Rosen was the most famous fool of Maximilian I. Like Triboulet, he was honored by a metal portrait, like something that would be given to someone, as well as a number of engraved portraits. And this engraving depicts him as a courtier, an intimate of the emperor. He's clearly an artificial fool, who are defined as artificial because their importance is based on their wealth and standing. So it's interesting that they even identified, to me, someone at court as being an artificial fool. Now we come to fun and games with fools. As the fool became a veritable institution, he and she had their place at court, but also among aristocratic games and entertainment. Fools commented on and parodied tournaments and jousts and attended court balls. Their presence seemed to have introduced an ironic dimension of these demonstrations of aristocratic sociability, kind of like a mime following somebody around and mimicking them, but like uncomfortable mirrors of their behavior. This is a painting that represents games of patrician sons of the Frauenkirche in the great market of Nuremberg, who are showing off their lancing and other skills. And a tournament like this, or tourney, was a chivalrous competition or mock fighting that was common in the Middle Ages and Renaissance. And they were all martial games, basically, so they were mock fighting. They included melee, fights on horseback, hand-to-hand combat, contests of strength or accuracy. And you see the infiltration of fools everywhere in here. A lot of them are kind of in red, but you can see them running about, kind of mockingly imitating what the young patricians were doing. Games also included tarot. And here we have 3 jesters that are part of the very, very earliest playing cards. And tarot was one of the most manufactured card games at the time. They appeared in the 15th century in Europe, and these are some of the very first known examples. So the fool was the ancestor, obviously, of the joker. And on the left is one of the earliest extant sets of playing cards from Northern Europe. It had 48 cards and 4 suits, and the 4 suits were France, Bohemia, Hungary, and the Holy Roman Empire. So this is a martial card game, obviously, in a sense. The figure of the jester was the lowest, and he appears here for the first time in a deck of cards, to anyone's knowledge. He plays the bagpipes and parodies a monk with his clothing and his tonsure, you know, the way that monks shave their heads in a circle. So his tonsure is also, I mean, they mocked clergy, so this becomes part of the fool's look. And the first known tarot cards were luxury items that were produced by Italian workshops for very wealthy clients who ordered them. And now they're referred to by the workshop's names typically. So the fool in the middle is represented as a man in rags that barely covers his nakedness. He has that vacant look that fools are supposed to have. And on the right, the fool card wears colorful rags with a smile or grimace. This is kind of a spooky image to me because I can't figure out if it's a smile or a grimace. And at the bottom of his feet, he's being attacked by children throwing stones at him and stripping his clothes off. So it's kind of a horrifying image. But folly and decency, and including sacrilegious bestiality, are representative behaviors of fools. And these are a far cry from the dignity of fools at court, obviously. The monkey dressed as a fool to the left was used for a giant deck of cards from Tyrol, which was done about 1580, and he represents the jack in the card deck. Monkeys were common substitutes for fools, and the stained glass fool with owl on the right is presenting a coat of arms to the glassmaker who made this. It's kind of a calling card by the glassmaker. And the fool is standing on a parapet, sticking his tongue out at an owl, and 4 workshop servants are above, dancing like wild children. But stained glass pieces like this were commissioned as presents for people in friendship. And to go back to owls, which I mentioned before, owls in medieval times didn't have the significance of wisdom that they're given today. They represented darkness, uncleanliness, and sometimes plague with which they were associated. This chess set was mind-blowing. It's nearly complete, and they think it represents 2 specific courts and their arms in miniature. It's Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor at the time, and he's identifiable by his protruding chin. And Isabella of Portugal is also recognizable, the queen. And these are details of the chess set. You can see the, again, more kind of lewd, a monkey. This is the rook. This is a back view of it, or front view of it. And then there's also a chess set. This chess set at the bottom right is really interesting because it wasn't in the show, but I had to show it to you because I didn't know that chess originated in India in the 17th century and was known as chaturanga. I bet a lot of people in this audience know what chaturanga is. So it means 4-limbed, and it translates to the 4 divisions of an army, which were elephantry, chariotry, cavalry, and infantry. And then if you're doing chaturanga, you're making your body into a little table, a little 4-legged table. So it all kind of came together, realizing this. But wherever it went, chess pieces came to reflect their own cultural context, wherever they had ended up. And the bishop position was an elephant for centuries, actually, as it spread into the Middle Ages. And fools in France were principally represented by bishops, which is interesting to me. Why would a bishop be a fool? But the diagonal movement that they made was apparently like just so outrageously not unlike correct battle behavior that it was seen as a kind of a wild, foolish behavior. Royal folly. So here we have on the left a collection of fictional dialogues made with the mad king of France, Charles VI, by Pierre Le Fruitier. And it was written by his secretary, Pierre Salmon. And the musicians in this illustration reference David playing the harp to soothe the madness of King Saul, which is subtly alluding to Charles VI madness. And he was known as both the beloved and the mad. He was anti-Semitic in the extreme. He was plagued by some psychotic episodes that actually, one of which famously occurred right on a battlefield where he started to slay his own people. And it was a tumultuous and disastrous reign that occurred during the 100 Years' War, really bad timing, destructively making the Treaty of Troy with the English in 1415, after his disastrous battle at Agincourt, where he was completely defeated. And he disinherited his son, the Dauphin Charles. It goes on and on. But which brings us to Joan of Arc, which I just wanted to talk about briefly. She's not represented in the Figure du Fou exhibition, but she seems to me to be completely in the Fool for God category, like St. Francis. And 7 years after Charles the Mad died, in February 1429, Joan, who was a teenage peasant from Domremy, arrived at the Armagnac court in Chinon Castle to petition Charles' son, the Dauphin, to allow her to lead the French to victory against the English.
by orders of the King of Heaven. Because he thought he had nothing to lose, he agreed. Her 4-day success at the Battle of Orléans in 1429 was perceived as a total miracle, and she was then given 1 day to storm Burgundian Paris, which is a slightly larger context, which at the time was allied with the British, and she failed. Then she failed at La Charité and Compiègne, and she was handed to the British in November of 1430. We all know the end of the story. She was tried, denounced, burned at the stake as a heretic and a witch at 19 years old. But her conviction was overturned in 1456. Her inspiration helped turn the tide in the Civil War, and that began the conclusion of the 100 Years' War. So after centuries of peasant popularity, she officially became a natural symbol of France after the French Revolution, which is why I suspect she wasn't included in the show. I don't think they wanted to call her a fool, but I'm really curious at her omission. Fools in Dance and Music. This is, it's after 4, sorry. This is a Moresca dance. These are 2 Moresca dancers that were made, they're copies of dancers that were made by Erasmus Glasser in 1480. They were part of a set of 16 figures made for the Duke Albrecht IV of Bavaria. And he was, the artist was described as an unpeaceful, confused, and willful servant of the state. So he was a hard man to corral, but he made beautiful figures. And they were meant to highlight colonial control of nations worldwide, and part of a heraldic decoration program. The figure on the left wears a fool's costume, like a hybrid of Germanic and Moorish dress, and besides wearing bells and other trappings of fools, they're representative of fools for art, because their wholeheartedness in dancing was thought as a kind of possession that referred to fool behavior. A footnote, however, I read this apart from the catalog, but I was fascinated by it. These sculptures prefigure the vast amount of decorative work in the 17th and 18th century depicting emotionless slaves as stands, torchieres, and lamp holders, and I think we've probably seen some of those in America, that became fixtures of colonial Europe and America. They offer important cultural evidence of the attempt to legitimize and normalize the horrors of slavery. So I think we should all be aware of that. An example of the fool in music, the songbook of Zeger van Mal, a cloth merchant from Bruges, comprises 1,200 pages divided into 4 manuscripts, each volume being dedicated to a voice, like bass, tenor, soprano. There was intense musical activity in the former Burgundian Netherlands, and these songs were secular songs in French, Flemish, and Latin, madrigals from Italy, and a repertoire of masses. And you'll see the fool right here, who seems to be, it's kind of odd, he is holding a small trumpet, and he's playing for his own scepter, who has his face. It's kind of like a snake with snake charmer. Now, Bach to Bruegel. So this is the triumph of the fool in the Renaissance. The fool on the left wears a particularly elaborate jester's costume. He's devouring a broken egg, which is notable because in the 16th century, the image of fools hatching from eggs was common. So it forms a vicious circle of foolishness, in a sense, and also indicates gluttony, one of the 7 deadly sins. The concert in the egg to the right is clearly a variation on the Ship of Fools and is thought to be a faithful copy of the original. Don't miss the singer in a gray monk's robe, you see him right here, who is so intent on his music that he doesn't notice that he's being robbed. The attribution of this painting as being by a follower of Bach was made partly based on the musical notation, which forensically shows notes of the song Toute la nuit, every night, by Thomas Créquillon from 1549. And Bach had died in 1516, so it had to have been a copy. And then, this is a beautiful Bach painting. Satire of Debauched Revelers is the title. And the cultural proliferation of fools gave rise to different myths, claiming to explain fools' origins and their prevalence throughout the world. and particularly with the idea of the Narrenschiff, the ship of fools. And it just seemed like nobody could get enough of this apocalyptic vision at the time. It was done over and over and over again. This painting by Hieronymus Bosch is one of the disassembled altarpiece triptychs that he made called Pilgrimage of Life. And though it depicts a boat full of debauched passengers, it's not thought to have been specifically intended to be a ship of fools, but it clearly is, since it's a satire of revelers feasting and drinking heavily aboard a tiny ship adrift at sea. The only formal figure of a fool who's identified by his costume and Bauble is sitting alone on the branch of the tree set on the deck, his back turned, oh, sorry, he's right there. And it's an interesting image. It could be an absurdist image of a tree without place to go, and here you have this figure of a fool, and we don't really know why he's so turned away from the festivities. As a fool, he had a job to promote these sorts of things. But as the exhibition stated, in a world overcome by vice and folly, the fool has no more lessons to give. So maybe it's the despair of the fool. I'm very curious about the image of the tree on the deck of the ship. It seems absurdist, so maybe it's a tree meant to show that it's on board with fools with no place to go or grow. The home of a fool, or it could also symbolize being uprooted. And some people have speculated that the tree references the tree of good and evil, but it's really hard to know the exact context. But we have that little tree at the bottom of the Vanitas sculpture that I showed you before. And then this was obviously not in the show, this painting by Kehinde Wiley. But I was fascinated that he took so directly from the 16th century to do this painting. And that also, this painting by Kehinde Wiley is part of another triptych that references people lost in a Narrenschiff. So I would say Kehinde Wiley's is more like a hope against hope tree in your boat, whereas the previous ones are kind of like everything's lost. But it also led me to think about surrealism. Like, what did surrealism mean to medieval and Renaissance people and artists? It's a damn good question, because of course we give surrealism the beginning of the 20th century as its birthday, but I think that there is like an argument to be made for there being a good deal of surrealism. Witness the Man Tree by Hieronymus Bosch on the left, and then its use in the painting The Garden of Earthly Delights on the right. So this probably was made for the Garden of Earthly Delights, and it's a pen and bistro drawing from 1470, and it's a satire of vanity, folly, and its consequences, and this was in the show, but the Hieronymus Bosch Garden of Heaven and Hell was not in it. But in the Man Tree, the drawing originates from the bottom of a little boat. The Man Tree itself comes from the bottom of a little boat. See, it's on the water, and it turns into an egg that, as we know, spawns fools. And then it's twinned by a second ship and a second tree, crowned with an owl, and we know about owls now. And in the drawing, it's a self-supporting world in the midst of nature, but it doesn't seem accidental that the Man Tree doesn't have leaves or any signs of growth and seems to be separate from the natural world around it. And when it becomes the locus of hell in the Garden of Earthly Delights, I would say that it's arrived at its natural habitat, a damned world without growth and balance. So what did people do about fools? Well, they had the idea of the extraction of the stone of madness, because a lot of people speculated that it was caused by something lodged in the brain. And this is a painting by Bosch, The Extraction of the Stone of Madness, an imaginary operation and a very popular subject also. The text reads, "Master, cut the stone out fast." And at the bottom, "My name is Lubert Das." And Lubert Das was a comical fool in Dutch literature. Many elements in the painting, like the flower and Lubert's bulging patch, and his pants have a sexual connotation within the period, suggesting that this is a painting about a cure for lust. And the operation is being performed by a doctor who's given away as a charlatan by wearing a funnel hat. Bizarre. I just want to add that Michel Foucault, in History of Madness, wrote, "Bosch's famous doctor is far more insane than the patient he is attempting to cure, and his false knowledge does nothing more than reveal the worst excesses of a madness immediately apparent to all but himself." Also, this image prefigures lobotomies in a very strange way, which was also not discussed, and there were occasionally real quacks that offered madness extraction as part of their services. But at the time, most disturbed souls in the 16th century lived with their families, and they were humanely accepted. This is one of my favorite things in the show. All of this kind of leads us to Jules Griet, or Mad Meg, which clearly owes a huge debt to Bosch. It's by Peter Bruegel the Elder. And Jules Griet is a figure of Flemish folklore, of Virago, a man-like woman in the mold of Joan of Arc who leads an army of women to pillage hell. Jules at the time meant either mad or foolish, and Griet comes from the name Margaret, which was a name given to any shrewish, bad-tempered woman, and communicated the idea of a bad, foolish behavior, as well as someone who's had about enough. The title refers to the Flemish proverb, "She could plunder in front of hell and return unscathed." And in this painting, she's arrived, see the eyes and the nose and the mouth opening? So that's the mouth of hell, where she's arrived. What kills me about this painting is that she's taking it upon herself to battle hell and its demons, like Don Quixote, in spite of the chaos of the time that she's clearly in. But this is a time of constant plagues, wars, scarcity, unbelievable economic inequality, and misogyny, leading to all manner of violence, including the encouragement of underpaid armies to pillage poor village households. So this arises from a very specific thing, actually. And don't miss that the spoils of war that she carries are pots and pans and a little food and nothing else. So this is just like a really angry woman. I'm relating to her. Anyway, there is another proverb that says, 1 woman makes a din, 2 women a lot of trouble, 3 an annual market, 4 a quarrel, 5 an army, and against 6 the devil himself has no weapon. Let that be right. This is an amazing painting called Netherlandish Proverbs, or the Topsy-Turvy World, and it was made by Peter Bruegel the Elder in 1559. The epitome of the proverb painting was popular in the 1500s, and this has to be its absolute classic. There are 126 proverbs illustrated in it, and Peter Bruegel the Younger made at least 16 copies of this iconic painting because its popularity was so over the top. And it's interesting, look at the center of the painting right here, because these 2 things are significant. I made detail blow-ups. So the image on the left was not identified as being specific to any proverbs, but it's the center of the painting. So it has some sort of importance, I would say, and seems to be key to the general theme of lessons unlearned by humanity, and in this case, the hypocrisy of the clergy. The image on the right depicts the blue cloak, or the folly of the world, and putting the blue cloak on a man was an indication that he was being cuckolded. So these are 2 kinds of immoral behavior that are expressed. These are the proverbs that we still use today, armed to the teeth and to bell the cat in one single image. In the center, to swim against the tide, and to the right is don't bang your head against a brick wall. And then we also have these 3, which I kind of wish were still in use, to tile your roof with tarts, which means to have like a superabundance of everything, to hang over a privy, to hang like a privy over a ditch, which means to be either very obvious Or it's also referencing the proverb, they crap in the same hole, meaning to be the best of friends. And then the one on the right is to seize bears dancing, which means that you are so hungry you could eat a horse. And I don't know why to see bears dancing seems like a good way of describing being really hungry, but it does to me. And then this is a fool's cap map of the world, which was made as a kind of a vanitas map, if you will. It has proverbs all over it. It has warnings all over it. I won't go into them. And it kind of goes back and forth from don't be a fool and don't be immoral to who isn't a fool, who isn't nuts. And the map itself in the center is amazingly accurate, I think. Look at Africa, look at South America. And it's supposed to be a reminder that we don't really know the world. And I'm thinking, I think they did pretty well. But yeah. So now we're getting to the end. So this is the beginning of the fading of the fool as the fool of the Renaissance and the rise of the fool as madman. And these are two great Goya prints that were in the show. The Sleep of Reason produces monsters, and then the Carnival Folly. Shakespeare wrote at the turn of the 17th century, and he had like, I think 29 fools in his works. They're often tragic figures, as we mentioned, trying to tell truth to power. And then there's a big hiatus of foolery in the 17th century. But in the 18th and the first half of the 19th century, the fool as madman reemerged in art, usually as characters, reflecting the madness of the time. So, and the reemergence of In Praise of Folly by Erasmus had a lot to do with people rethinking madness itself and the state of the world and what politics and war should be. But the emergence of psychiatry also started happening at this time. Goya's etchings drew from his own experience. The one on the left, The Sleep of Reason produces monster, might be a reference to the Age of Reason. And Disparates on the right refers to follies and irrationalities. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with Goya's etchings, but they're phenomenal, phenomenal works of art, and they're painful. They're raw in many cases. This painting was included in the show. It's called Yard with Lunatics, an insane asylum yard with lunatics. And he remembered having seen this as a youth in Zaragoza and painted it. And I think it gives you the feeling of being at the bottom of the world. You know, it's kind of all these struggling bodies. It's no hope. It's a small painting, but it has a huge impact. And then this was one of his last paintings. He did it in the Quinta del Sordo. He lived in a home in Spain called the House of the Deaf, or the Villa of the Deaf. And he painted this after Spain became a wreck, after it was invaded by Napoleon, and then there was a liberation war that produced further destruction, and Goya found himself at his wit's end at his country home, called as I said, the Villa of the Deaf. And he painted astonishing, urgent depictions of the state of humanity. And San Isidro is a pilgrimage site that people would go to. It was the most popular pilgrimage site in Spain. So he painted this version, but I found that it had been preceded years before. This is a small pastoral work that he did that was commissioned as a sketch for a tapestry with sunny colors and a picnic atmosphere. And it's so crushingly sad to me to see that this was then his truly realized version. I have to say none of those two paintings were in the exhibition, but I just had to show them because I love Goya and because they're so powerful. And I just think that, people said Goya must have been mad himself, or he suffered from Meniere's disease or lead poisoning from his paints or some other condition. but I think his paintings always kept order in their depictions, so I kind of don't believe that. I think he was a deeply grieving person for his country and for himself, and he was fearless and visionary, even at his most despondent. I don't know if you know that the word gargoyle comes from gargling. It's the same thing. It indicates throats, and gargoyle mouths allow for the spillage from rains to pass through them. So it's an interesting etymology of the word. And gargoyles, as we all know, were used on building decorations. And they're also not unlike, they're kind of in a similar category as grotesques, which I would say that the figure to the right of the left-hand image more depicts. And they tended to be, both of them tended to have animals and humans, and sometimes monstrous amalgamations of both of them. And they were hybrid creatures, and they were meant to ward off evil spirits. And the word grotesque, in the term of grotesque, comes from grotto, and the grottos are underworlds, grottos are caves. And it's interesting to me that both in medieval times when the gargoyles were made and in this brilliant painting by Victor Hugo, you have this kind of sense of the subterranean, the darkness, the psychology, the unconscious begging to be better known. So I think that, I personally think that gargoyles and grotesques prefigured psychology, and of course, natural fools would have seemed part of them. Did you all know that there's a Victor Hugo museum in Paris? The Place des Vosges. It's an amazing thing. He was, besides his enormous literary contribution, he was a great artist. And Notre Dame de Paris and its character Quasimodo broke out in 1831 and was very, very popular. And then 1 year later, he opened a play called Le Roi s'amuse, The King Has Fun, which featured a gesture called triboulet. Remember triboulet from the other slides? The white carved bas-relief that looks so noble. That's actually a different Triboulet, but Triboulet was also a playwright and an actor, the fool Triboulet. And it's interesting to me that Hugo, who was a playwright and a writer and a novelist, used Triboulet as his hero in this play, The King Has Fun, because it's a tragic work, and then it had one appearance. It was shown once, and the government shut it down. And then 50 years later, it was shown for the second time. In between, Verdi took the story and wrote Rigoletto, which is the same exact plot. And people 50 years later kind of went, wait, we're all watching and enjoying Rigoletto. What happened to that play? And they reopened it, and it was a huge hit. So, interesting. This painting by Géricault, called Woman with a Gambling Mania, was done as a part of 10 portraits that he made for his therapist. Not surprisingly, after the poor reception of his phenomenal painting, The Raft of the Medusa, which I'm sure you all know, he fell into a deep depression, thank you critics, and was helped by one of the founders of social psychiatry named Etienne Jean Georget. And Géricault produced these paintings at a time that the public was fascinated by madness, but Georget was trying to show society that these were real people that needed help rather than derision and isolation. So it's impressive to me that Géricault did this, and really shortly before his death. He died at a tragic young age. Philippe Pinel, La Salpêtrière is the name of this picture, which is, the Salpêtrière was a famous psychiatric hospital, and a twofold movement in the 19th century gave us new significance to the theme of the Fool, which were the rise of psychology as a medical practice with therapeutic inventions, and the growing understanding that mental illness was a disease and did not lead inevitably to criminality, which had been assumed. So after the French Revolution, the practice of confinement for the mentally ill was called into question. And this painting hails Dr. Philippe Pinel, who is considered the father of modern psychiatry, for taking a compassionate view towards patients. And this painting specifically depicts him ordering patients to be unshackled. And it's interesting that the scale of this painting is 11.5 by 16.5 feet. It was a huge painting. It was one of the biggest paintings that was in the show. And it was just amazing and encouraging to me that there had been that kind of reception of it. I'll try to get through this quickly. So the point about madness being a popular subject in the 1800s, on the left you have the exorcism of King Charles VI, who people have likened to a scene from Shakespeare because, like King Lear, he seems to be gesturing to something that you can't see. It's in your field, but you can't see it. And it's a piece of theater, really dramatic, and was rich subject matter in the 19th century when people were fascinated by madness. In the center is Queen Joanna of Castile, known as Joanna the Mad, and this shows her at age 16. Now, this is an old picture from the turn of the 15th to 16th centuries. She was married to Philip the Handsome of Austria. They were married for 28 years. She was very passionate, and in 1502, he left her, Philip the Handsome, left her in Spain to go back to Flanders and his affairs, which were not always affairs of state. And she never got over his death in 1506, and though she managed to have herself recognized as heir to the crown of Castile, her governance coincided with her new nickname, Joanna the Mad, and that became her undoing. And then the painting on the right is the exorcism of Joanna the Mad. And please look at the way that the characters and gestures of the people that are trying to exorcise her are, because this painting was very, very specifically referenced as having an unmistakably violent undercurrent that was anti-Joanna, at least. And its elements are the overturned stool, the anxious air of the exorcisers, same thing practically in this case, the menacing priest. They were all ganging up on her. And the catalog said, diabolical possession and political dispossession are the stakes of this scene, which echoes above all the cultural state of Western Europe of the 19th century, whether it is the war of influence between church and state or patriarchal anxieties in the face of nascent female emancipation. This painting of a wise fool, it's a Polish painting. It's probably the most famous Polish painting. It goes back directly to Bosch's Debauched Revelers, because the title is Stansic during a ball at the court of Queen Bona in the face of the loss of Smolensk. So Stansic, who lived from 1480 to 1560, was the most famous Polish court jester ever. He was employed by 3 consecutive Polish kings, and he's depicted here as the only person at the ball who's troubled by the news that the Muscovites have captured Smolensk, which was a grave, grave event in the course of this war. But the court had chosen to ignore that in favor of their minor success at the Battle of Orsha. So they were celebrating, in his vision, nothing. It certainly feels familiar today, although it was meant to reflect the political situation of Poland in the 19th century, and it includes portents of misfortune in the upper left. There's a shooting star, and there's the belt of Orion above the church spire, and Orion is the mythological hunter who is blinded by his own ego. And this painting, I didn't know this because I didn't get it, but Lady Gaga recently featured this image on her album Harlequin, which came out for her recent film with Joaquin Phoenix, Joker, Folie à Deux. So that's kind of interesting. This is the last slide. Oh, no, it's not. Sorry. This is Courbet's portrait, self-portrait with black dog. And he came to Paris to make a name for himself, was accepted at the Salon of 1844, and he contributed this very self-assured looking self-portrait. But other self-portraits were a little less secure, and this is the painting that I'm ending on. This is called Madman with Fear, and this is Gustave Courbet's painting that was painted 2 years after the other one. The other one was dated 1842 to 1844, and this is 1844. So it's a painting of dramatic introspection, which is kind of an interesting, but certainly true idea. And he depicts madness in an ungrounded surreality. It's a classic example of romanticism, and the abyss is created by his brushstrokes, by the thing that he most loves. He's created, I think in a sense he's creating his own abyss, but it's so radical and it's so existential and it's so unfinished. It's aggressively present and it's starting to fall apart, and it's really quite an astonishing painting. It's kind of small, but it leaves a big impact. Aristotle linked madness to one's character and said that no excellent soul is exempt from a mixture of madness. Seneca declared that there is no great genius without a tincture of madness, but Goethe took a dimmer view of the human condition, stating, "We do not have to visit a madhouse to find disordered minds. Our planet is the mental institution of the universe." So that's it. Sorry, that was so long.
Thank you, April. Do we have some lights? Thank you. We have gone a little bit over our time. I know people are arriving for the next thing, but maybe do you want to take one question?
Sure.
Is there one question? Make it really good.
Star or?
No pressure. Star.
I want to thank you. You went to Europe and came back with a fantastic slideshow. I just very much appreciate it. I am not asking a question about madness, although I love the way you ended it. It opened it up to the universe, so to speak. But I went to the theater to see a movie about 1971, one-to-one John Lennon and, Oko. And his last concert was to draw attention to mental illness and it's the wonderful footage of it in this movie that's right down the street. So I just wanted to say so. Thank you.
Thank you.
We'll see if it's still there.
Thank
when
you.
We now want to go see it because of what you said.
Thank you.
You guys, I'm sorry that it was so long, but it was just so much. It was so